Today on the Lowdown, a Down syndrome podcast, Hina Mahmood gives us the lowdown on Down syndrome and sensory processing. Over to you, Hina Mala.
Thanks, Danielle. Hi there, and welcome to the Lowdown. I hope you're doing well today. I'm Marla Folden, and I'm here today with my fabulous co-host and guest of the day, Hina Mahmood. How are you doing?
I'm good.
Excellent. I can't wait for today. It's going to be, we're getting into things.
We're getting into things today. One of my favorite topics to talk about.
I know. We talk about it probably at least twice a week.
At least.
So today's episode focuses on a really complex topic that can feel a little bit, nebulous. We're talking sensory processing today. We'll take a deep dive into how sensory processing can affect everyday functioning and talk about strategies to help individuals with Down syndrome cope with those sensory challenges. So if you don't know Hina, you should. And I'll tell you a little bit about her right here. She is DSRF's senior OT, and she's been with DSRF, we think 14 years now. It's been a minute.
Yeah.
And she's trained in the SOS approach to feeding and given presentations on topics including toileting, increasing independence in school-age kids, executive functioning, those kind of things. And she's also interested in the medical stuff, which is part of the reason why she's in this podcast. So we're talking things like sleep apnea, digestive issues, all the things that affect learning and development for individuals with Down syndrome. Hello, Hina.
Hi. It's weird to be on the other side of the mic again.
I know.
But very happy
I have
to
the
be
easy job today. I just get to ask questions and you have to answer them.
Oh boy. Okay.
Let's start at the very beginning. So in brief, what are our senses and what is sensory processing?
Yeah, great. So sensory processing is the way the nervous system receives messages from all of our senses and kind of turns them into the appropriate motor and behavioral responses. So we're all familiar with those 5 basic senses, which is our vision, our hearing, our smell, taste, and touch. And there are 3 additional senses. So there's actually a total of 8. And we can jump into them in a little bit, but just a brief overview. So the 6th sense is known as proprioception. So this is our sense of our body in space, our body awareness. We all have joints and muscles, and on those joints and muscles there are receptors that tell us how our bodies are moving. So it kind of that's the sense that tells you right now that you're sitting on a chair and your butt's touching the bottom of the chair, or your hand is on your lap, your feet are touching the floor while you're sitting and listening to Marla and I discuss all things sensory. So that proprioception piece is the 6th sense.
And it kind of tells you like which joints are at which angles almost, and like where is there pressure on you, which things are kind of floating freely and which things are like on the ground or on your chair.
Yeah. And it's based off push and pull forces. So you're understanding how hard you're pushing or pulling something, or, it's proprioception is really great because it kind of tells you when you're grounded. It gives you that feeling of grounding. So that's why it's a very important piece for our people with Down syndrome. The 7th sense is somewhat linked to proprioception, which is our vestibular sense. So this is our sense of movement. It tells us how fast our bodies are moving. It's based off of our sense of balance and movement, and it's controlled by the part of the brain that controls coordination and balance. So our vestibular sense is telling us when we're, stepping off a curb, when we're walking across the street, how fast our bodies are moving, how the angle change of our head is impacting, when we're looking up and down, looking side to side to see, if it's safe to cross the road. So that vestibular sense is kind of helping with the movement and the balance of our entire body.
And so for people who've like ever been car sick, for example, or let's say you step off of a stair that was maybe like shorter or taller than you anticipated, and you like fall for a half second or hit the ground faster than you thought you were going to, that's your vestibular sense kind of on high alert, telling you like, oh, that was not the plan.
Something is not right.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. And the interesting thing is that the proprioceptive and vestibular sense kind of work together. So if we take the example of going on a roller coaster. So when you are on a roller coaster, there's a lot of vestibular ups and downs and all arounds. When you get off a roller coaster, you kind of feel like a little wobbly.
Still going.
You're
Yeah.
still going, right? So you're like, okay, how do I get myself centered and grounded? So that's where that proprioceptive piece comes in, where you walk around, you put enough pressure on your feet as you're walking, then your body starts to, and your nervous system starts to feel more grounded. So this is why your OTs would always recommend, if your kids are jumping up, down on a trampoline, that's great, but it also should always be followed by that proprioceptive deep pressure input so that we can feel grounded and not floaty. And then the final, the eighth sense that's getting a lot more research, and it's a really, really important one as well for our people with Down syndrome, is called interoception. So kind of thinking about the inter part. So that interoception is our body awareness from the inside. So our internal sensations. These sensors and receptors are on our organs. So it tells us if we're hungry or thirsty. It tells us if we're in pain, hot or cold. If we need to go to the bathroom. If we've finished going to the bathroom. Pressure. So all of those things are kind of connected in a way where then our brain is receiving the signals of what's going on internally in our bodies.
And I think like everybody can relate to that. Like, oh, like we need to stop the car because like I really need the washroom. That's interoception. I feel bloated. That's interoception. I have heartburn. That's interoception. Like all of those internal messages that alert you to like you need to do something differently would be interoception.
Yeah. So those are our senses. So yeah. And I think it's just important to understand how that there's more than 5 and how all 8 of them can work together to kind of give us information at any given time while, throughout our day. So if you're just sitting here listening to this podcast, you can do like a environmental scan and kind of think about all the sensory things and inputs that are coming to your brain at this very moment, right? So you're thinking, okay, the bright sunshine is coming in through the window. The AC is on blast, so I'm feeling a bit chilly. So it's always really great for anyone's sensory health to just do an environmental scan once in a while and see what is impacting your body and what senses you're having to process at any given moment.
Oh, you've set me up so well for our next question, because we hear a lot in the news and elsewhere about sensory processing or processing disorder. What does that even mean? Can we talk about where that term comes from and why it's applied so widely?
Yeah, absolutely. So sensory processing disorder in itself is it's not included in any diagnostic manual yet. So it's often a part of another diagnosis. So for example, sensory processing disorder is connected to autism very often, especially in popular media. But a lot of people can have sensory processing challenges, but not have autism or not have Down syndrome. So it is in itself a challenge of sensory processing, but just to kind of let everyone know that it's not always connected to ASD or Down syndrome or anything, but it can be part of the picture. So for some people, sensory processing disorder essentially for some people is the sensations that come with being and moving in the world are so overwhelming and confusing at that brain and body level that you rarely feel safe. A lot of people that experience these challenges feel unsafe, which is a really odd feeling, or their nervous system feels unorganized. So you're not really understanding what's going on and how it's impacting you at that moment. So for this group, everyday sensory experiences and events can seem toxic, dangerous. They feel overwhelmed or confused. And it's really important to remember that we all process sensory information and we all have certain sensory inputs that we might find aversive or we might seek out. So this is not, we all are having sensory processing challenges to some degree if you really think about it, right? So you can think about some examples such as I think you and I were talking earlier today about having a headache or a migraine. I'm sure there's quite a few people out there that are suffering from migraine. So that is a sensory, it's worsened by the senses around you. So the lights are too bright or the noises are too loud. Internally, you're feeling nauseous because of the headache coming on. You're seeing that aura. So I think, we all have those challenges. But the difference between perhaps you and I versus somebody with Down syndrome or autism is that it's a little bit easier for us to figure out how to deal with that stimuli or how to avoid it.
Right. I have a story that maybe families or adults who are listening can relate to. So, you're in the morning, you're not really awake yet. Your kids are squawking at you because they want their muffin and you haven't had coffee, but the coffee machine is on and loud. And when that happens to me in the morning, I'm looking around like, do we have earplugs? Like this is too much noise. I am not awake. I am not ready for this volume yet. And that is an example of being too sensitive for my environment. And I have some coping strategies. I wish I had better earplugs, but I might leave the room for a second or try and look around for what will shush my squawking toddlers the fastest. Can we put some raisins on the table so I can get to the oatmeal? Those kind of things. And I can strategize around it. And that's something that is really challenging for our students to do when they are in this sort of almost fight or flight situation with their senses giving them too much information. And then to be able to think your way out of that stress is really hard.
And I think that thinking your way out of it is a really important piece too. So, strategies is one thing, but rationalizing, being like, okay, this will be over soon, or I can do this. That problem solving piece can be tricky sometimes. So, and it is very helpful to have that in place.
Let's talk a little bit about, do we know anything about the prevalence of sensory processing issues in the population of people with Down syndrome?
Yeah. So there is research that indicates that about 49% of school-age kids and slightly older as well have sensory processing challenges.
A lot.
But when compared to 5 to 16% of the typically developing population. So there's a definite
big deal.
Piece. It's one thing to see it in our everyday, work at the DSRF, but when there is research to support that there is challenges. And then for our people that have an additional diagnosis like autism, that sensory processing stuff can get more amplified and more challenging. So and we have seen that quite a lot with our population here.
And in terms of things that are disruptive to the plan of the day, this particular area ranks very highly in things not going the way you wanted them to go because something got in the way. This is that thing a lot of the time. Now, there's more than one way for any of your 8 senses to kind of act up, I guess is how I would put it, or not do what you kind of need them to do, or not give you information in a way that you can process easily. So I'm talking about hypersensitivity and hyposensitivity. So before we talk in depth about our senses, let's define those so that everybody knows what we're talking about.
Fantastic. Yeah. So hypersensitivity is someone who has increased sensitivity to a stimulus, right? Or to some sort of sensory input. So somebody who is just that much more sensitive to, for example, clothing tags is a really good example, right? So for you and I, we can kind of feel a clothing tag on our shirt, but for somebody who's hypersensitive to that sensory stimuli, just the lightest touch can be very aversive for them. So
they need less input to make it feel like a big deal.
Yeah. And I think a lot of people get the sensory sensitivity and avoiding thing confused, and they're very different things. So avoiding is where you just want to not even be putting yourself in that situation and flee. Sensitivity is that it is just, you're just that much more aware of it. Your threshold is very low. So it's kind of impacting you at a higher rate than a typically developing person where it might just take that much more for it to register on your system. So that's a hypersensitivity.
So that would be like having a tag on your shirt that you notice, but you keep noticing it all day long.
All day long. Yeah. It could be just
you don't tune it out.
Portion of it touching your skin, and it is like your skin is
just
on
annoying.
fire.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's hypersensitivity. And then hyposensitivity is someone who just needs more input at a higher rate, higher intensity, sometimes even higher frequency for it to register on their nervous system. So some examples like, a lot of our students with Down syndrome, especially our adults, are loving the black coffee, right? So they just need something with that much, or like really cold water.
Yep. Strong flavors. A lot of our younger students, you'll see, love to crash and fall or like bump into things or spin. Exactly. So they're just needing that much more. In schools, you'll see that a lot of our kids are holding their pencil too tight because it's just not just holding a pencil regularly is not impacting their system. They just need to hold it that much tighter so that it registers. Know that it's there.
And that signal gets to the brain like, oh, you're holding a pencil. So this hyposensitivity pattern is obviously very common in Down syndrome. And we see hyper as well. But the hypo is, it's quite common. And we can go through some of the senses. And
let's do that. But I want to point out before we go further, if you're like, wait, what now? It gets more complicated by the fact that somebody's profile can be mixed. Yes. So it's not all one way or all the other way. And this is where you need your OT to help you, because it can be a really complex picture sometimes for students where, one sense on one part of the body is one way and in another part it's a different way. And you want other eyes on it if you're thinking that this is a piece of your kid's picture.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's also important to just kind of think about how it's a very subjective experience, right? So how you take on a sensory input will be very different than how I perceive it and how I deal with it. So, and these patterns change throughout the lifetime as well. So,
and it's real, right? It's not just real. Somebody... being annoying comes to mind, and that's not a nice thing to say, but it's not just
they're trying to get out of something, or they're just trying to cause a problem.
It's like their brain is actually over responding or under responding to something. So it's a neurological thing much more than a personality thing. Anyway, I digress. Let's get into our senses here. Did you want to start on maybe vision and what hypo and hypersensitivity could look like?
So for vision, if a person is hyposensitive, so that means that they need that much more input for it to register. You might see some people, especially with our guys with Down syndrome, may experience figuring out where objects are in a busy background, right? Like they're just not aware of, even it could be something super bright and it's just not registering on their system. So they're looking for that one particular toy in a shelf, and it's just like, I can't find it because it's just not registering on my visual system. Too many distractors.
And we find like board games can often be really hard to like follow a trail on a board game, because there's so much in the background picture of the board game that it's hard to find like, where's the next blue square? I have no idea, because there's too many things in there.
That's why light up toys are such a huge popular thing for, especially for our younger students, because it is just making that much more of an impact, and it's registering more on their system. A lot of the kids that are hyposensitive may also be attracted to lights. Like I said, they're fascinated with reflections and bright colors. And then a lot of them may walk around like, running their hands around the edges of certain things. They like to feel. And that's another sense, but it kind of plays into vision as well, where their visual system needs an additional input for it to register what they're actually
what it is
seeing.
That they're seeing. And we have some kids who will come and like feel the floor, for example, in doorways. And that's because their eyes maybe aren't giving them enough info about like, what is that change in texture actually? And like, are we stepping up, down? We don't really know. Is it flat? And they need extra info from a hand to say like, oh, okay, we're not going up into that room. It's actually just like part of the door frame.
Then conversely, if we think about those that are hypersensitive, so that means that their vision is just too acute. They're just really, really honing in on the littlest things, and it's just impacting their system at a much higher rate. So, they'll notice the tiniest fluff on a carpet. You and I have had clients in the past where they're just scratching, or they're just like swiping away at something you and I can't see, but for them their vision is so acute in terms of their perception that they're like, nope, I see something and it needs to go, or
it's very distracting for me.
Very distracting. They also they might be the opposite of our hyposensitive. people where they'll dislike bright lights and they want to, look down most of the time or be frightened by sharp flashes of light. So it's just too much to process.
And sometimes we'll have children who will opt to like sit inside something that they can close. So we have like these kind of funky spinning egg chairs that have a little curtain that you can close. And some students would really prefer to spend a lot of time in there where it's dark and there's not any unexpected flashing lights. We have had students prefer to put their head in buckets just as a way to minimize how much stimuli are coming at their eyes.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yes, but like if we move on to hearing, so, somebody who's hyposensitive to hearing may be the kind that seek out sounds, right?
They make a lot of sounds.
Or exactly. So they're seeking out a lot of sounds. They're, a lot of our students would like to put the speakers right up to their ear to really get that music in there. Or they're enjoy lots of like busy spaces and crowds and love sirens. They often, like you said, also create sounds themselves to stimulate their hearing. So like banging doors or, tapping things, tearing or crumpling paper, humming, making rhythmic sounds, right? So there's a lot of different ways that they're trying to get that input. And it, again, as you said earlier, it may seem quote unquote annoying, like, why are you doing that? It's really bugging me. But if you really think about the function of that, and it's like they're really trying to get something, some sort of auditory input so that their nervous system feels like it's getting what it needs. So
it's neurological again, neurological, not personality.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah. I think that should be the theme of this episode. It is neurological. And then, so like just kind of going through some of these. So hypersensitivity to hearing could be our kids that are light sleepers. So the littlest thing might wake them up.
Or kids who like cannot attend fireworks or big loud music, like live music.
They don't like their like baby cousin or brother or sister crying
babies, loud sirens, things that will upset them for like, a long period of time afterward.
And sometimes these guys will also, make up, they might make up their own sounds just so that they can drown out the other sounds too, right? So that's something you see that as well. Yeah. Shall we move on to taste and smell?
Yeah, let's do it. Taste and smell.
So if you're hyposensitive to taste and smell, you will chew and smell everything that you can get your hands on. They'll mouth and lick objects. Sometimes some of them will eat mixed food. They would like sweet and sour. They like those strong flavors, like you said earlier. So that is a common pattern with those that are hyposensitive to taste and smell. And then hypersensitive, they sometimes will run away from smell. So they might move away from people and insist on themselves wearing the same clothes all the time because it's a very predictable smell every time. I meant very like strong perfumey smells can be aversive to these guys as well.
And I mean, I feel like everybody can relate to the taste and smell one a little bit because if you've been sick and you're like, ugh, this food has no flavor. Like, where's my hot sauce?
Exactly.
That is hyposensitivity, right? You need more flavor to make that food taste good.
Yeah.
And certainly for a lot of our students, food almost in a way gets lost in their mouth. Like if it doesn't have enough flavor, it can go in the side of the mouth and then they can't, our students can't find it. That's why water is a problem often. It has no flavor and it's hard to gauge like, where is that water in my mouth? How much is even in there? And we see choking as a result of some of these challenges.
That's why a lot of our guys are stuffed their mouths as well. So it's a thing where they're not, it's not registering. And this is kind of just going back to the hyposensitivity part, that they're putting so much more food in their mouth so that they can feel like there's something in there. And then they can actually manage. But that is, again, of course, a big safety risk.
Yeah. And that's, am I wrong in thinking that's a combo between touch receptors in your mouth and flavor? So if both of them are a bit off, then your mouth has to be very full to feel like you have anything in there. Yeah.
And that's the thing, like, I think like just kind of, it's perfect timing to go into touch, but I think the touch sense is probably the most sensitive.
Yes.
So that's why we see a lot of mouthing of objects when kids are babies. They're exploring, right? Or they're like, rubbing their ears. So there's lots of places on the face that are very sensitive where a lot of our guys will seek out input. So it's important, like even some of our guys that tap their chin, it's a very sensitive part of the face. And that's where the stimuli is getting the most recognized by the brain, and hence that's why a lot of the things that they do are around the face,
around the jaw in particular. So let's talk about touch and sort of hyposensitivity in touch.
So with respect to hyposensitivity and touch, these guys are not able to feel pain or temperature the same way. You'll notice a lot of our guys sometimes are not appropriately dressed for the weather, right? So if it's super hot outside, they're coming in with the parka, just because their temperature regulation is very, very, very difficult for them. And especially we're recording this during August, where we're getting waves and waves of extreme hot weather. And I think being aware of the heat regulation piece is very, very important for our population, because they tend to get heat stroke much quicker. But in terms of other hyposensitivity things, drooling is a really big one. So you had mentioned just previously about how there's low awareness in the mouth area, and drooling is often a really, really big challenge for our guys and for families because of that low awareness around the area of the mouth, because they can't necessarily control it because of the low muscle tone, but they also can't feel it because of that low perception of that tactile impact.
Low perception. And drool's a really tricky one. It's body temperature. It doesn't often have any other markers other than the feeling of wet, which when you think about what wet actually is, it's actually just feeling slightly cooler on your body. And if your temperature regulation is poor, you might not notice something slightly cooler feeling on your face. And that's why drool doesn't necessarily, or dribble doesn't necessarily get noticed as readily. And our students can compensate for some of this by using visual markers. So you can show them themselves in a mirror and be like, you've drooled, like, do you want to work on that or wipe it up? But just feeling for it is not as effective.
Yeah, and it's just important to understand that if you're using terms like wet or dry, like are people understanding even what those verbal markers are too? Yeah. But definitely. Yeah. Okay, so let's move on to those three extra senses. So vestibular. So if you're hyposensitive, and we see this all the time with our friends with Down syndrome at the DSRF, they love all sorts of movement. Rocking back and forth, spinning. They can spin
huge
for hours and hours and hours. I start to feel sick when I see it happen, but it just kind of goes to show you how not all of them, but a majority of our guys with Down syndrome really seek that vestibular input. They really, really need more of it at a higher frequency and a higher intensity. So just a little spin on a chair sometimes isn't enough. They need like what EOTs call fast blast, which is just like high frequency, high intensity. You're just spinning. And it's just, that's how much they need to feel grounded and for their nervous system to feel organized.
So imagine then, because, if I were going to spin around on a 360 swing, I'd probably barf. But our students actually feel the opposite. They feel better having done some really fast spinning. It improves their sense of where am I in space? What's my balance like? And we see remarkable differences. I use the OT gym a lot for speech therapy because it works really well. So we will work on the swing, and then have a very productive session. And when it's not available for one reason or another, let's say there's another program or something, trying to mimic that on an office chair, let me tell you, it's not the same.
Not as
My
good.
students know
More
about
work
it.
for you too.
They do not love it.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's the thing, is just understanding that. I'm glad that you said that they feel better, right? It's a really important point, because so many of our guys, if your nervous system is not grounded, you cannot focus, you cannot do any kind of work. So if you need to spin for 15 minutes on a swing, and that causes you to be able to be more grounded and feel like you're centered and organized, then that is what you need to do.
Otherwise, you can't move past that. You're distracted by feeling
Well, they'll seek it in other ways, right? They'll seek it in other ways. If they're not being given that opportunity to get it in that particular way, then they will try any other way to get that movement. And you'll see all sorts of, like head jerks, or they're just like spinning in circles, or they're kind of, but so they're trying to do it on their own. But if we can provide them with the strategies to do it the right way, then they can
don't need to do it
get
all
it done
day.
in a shorter amount of time and then are able to focus. So, but yeah, for those that are hypersensitive like you and I, Marla, sometimes the spinning is not the best, but for our guys, those that are hypersensitive experience difficulty in changing directions. They kind of get disoriented, and walking or crawling for the young ones on uneven surfaces can be really tricky. So I had mentioned earlier, stepping onto or off to curbs, going up and down stairs can be really challenging. And especially when their feet are not touching the ground, right? So as OTs, we're big proponents of like positioning and seating. And always my number one thing is I make sure that feet are firmly planted on the ground in order to be able to feel that you are, you're getting that awareness through your body with the proprioceptive, which we'll talk about in a second, but it's also kind of helping you gauge your gravity and how you're moving. Yeah.
And we'll talk more about, what kind of functional activities are impacted in a second, because this is a big one. So keep this one in mind.
Yeah, absolutely. And then proprioception. So again, just a reminder that is your sense of body awareness. So how your body is moving in space. So if you're hyposensitive, you're having a real difficulty of knowing where your body is in space. So one example that I always give is like if you wake up in the middle of the night and you need to go to the bathroom and it's dark in your room, if you have poor proprioception, you don't know what's what. It's very hard for you to gauge where your hand is or my arms are. So it's kind of like that, but with the lights on for our guys with Down syndrome. So you'll see them try to get that input in whatever way they can so they understand where their body is. I had a parent once tell me after we talked about this, she's like, oh, that's why he's moving furniture around and why he's carrying heavy things is because he unknowingly is trying to get that proprioceptive input so he understands where his body is in space. So it's a really, this is why they love to fall. This is why they like to crash and bump into objects. Also a reason why sometimes they don't have the best grip and drop objects because they're just not understanding
how hard am I holding
how hard you're holding it. Exactly. Yeah. And then, for those that are hypersensitive to proprioception, they're just, the slightest movement or change in position, or if you touch them or if their hands move a different way can be aversive for them. So
stressful.
It can be very stressful. Yeah. And then finally is the biggie also, interoception. So that is the sensations from inside our body. So for those of our people that are hyposensitive, they're, again, not aware of pain, temperature. They don't understand if they need to pee until it's like at maximum capacity, right? So like a lot of us that are listening, you're like, I kind of need to pee, but I can wait for a little bit until, the podcast is finished. But for those guys, the pain part especially is like it needs to get to a level where a lot of us would find very difficult to manage and excruciating. But in order for it to register on their system, it needs to get to that level. So that's a challenging thing. And that's something that's, and especially if they have communication issues, I'm sure you can speak to that. But so that poor perception of the internal signals is why sometimes we'll overeat or undereat. So something to definitely keep in mind.
Yes. And this is a real safety concern. And this is why monitoring your child always for even very subtle behavioral changes to indicate any kind of pain. If they're showing you anything, it's probably much worse than it looks. And therefore very important to act upon it. And active, medical monitoring is really tiring for families, but it's kind of the only way because our students can't feel it, which doesn't mean there's not a problem, right? And in our episode with Dr. Bull that's on this season as well, she said she's even had patients with appendicitis who didn't register that level of pain. So it's really a serious thing.
It's a really serious thing. Exactly. Yeah. And then finally, for those that are hypersensitive to those internal sensations in the body, they're feeling heightened sensitivity to certain physiological cues associated with stress. So, for example, say, one's heart rate or breathing can have a cascading effect. So if you're all of a sudden very hypersensitive to the slightest change in your breathing or heart rate, that can cause anxiety, and then that can
Meltdowns.
just be a cascading effect to a meltdown. Exactly. So for a lot of us that are very hyper aware of what's going on in our body, I'm sure we can all understand that slightest little like double heartbeat for a second, you're like, oh, what's going on? What's wrong? So so that can sometimes emerge for our population as well. So yeah.
Let's talk. So we've covered hyper and hypo for each of the 8 senses, and I think it's really important to not leave it there, but also get into like the functional everyday activities that these differences are impacting. So let's talk a little bit about what this looks like every day, so that parents can either identify with it or be like, no, not a problem for my child right here, right now. And not every child has challenges in everything all the time, right? This is a changing profile over time with maturity and development and environment. There are many factors here.
Yeah.
So you don't need to be on the lookout for challenges in every single sense.
Exactly.
But often there are a few at play. Yeah. So let's get into that. Do you want to chat a little bit about like, how do your senses affect like things like toileting?
Yeah. So I think, I feel like our senses are going to affect almost everything that we do every day, but toileting, especially, all senses are impacted if you really think about it, right? So you're smelling things, you're touching different things when you're in the toileting routine. The soap might not feel right. The sound of the exhaust fan is too loud. So there's lots of those things, but some of the ones that might get missed are those 3 additional senses that we talked about. So you might feel afraid to sit on the toilet because your feet are not grounded on a footstool or on the ground. So that's that proprioceptive sense.
And feeling like you're going to then fall over.
Exactly. Right? So, and again, then the vestibular comes into play too. So if you don't have somewhere to stabilize your hand on a grab bar or counter and you're sitting there floating, you feel like you're going to fall into the toilet or off the toilet. So those things definitely play into it. And then the really big important one, why toilet training can be hard for our guys, is that interoceptive piece. So a lot of them have a really hard time gauging or understanding when they need to go to the bathroom, which is why initiating can be hard. Doesn't mean it can't be done, but it is just makes the toileting part a little bit more challenging. And once I kind of explain this to parents, they feel a little less stressed. They're like, okay, so there is a reason why it's hard.
It's not personality.
It's not personality. It's not a physiological, it is a neurological and physiological thing, but it is something that can be overcome, right? So for self-initiation, I often say to parents that, parents always say that and you as a parent will say this, I'm sure, that you have a tell when your kid needs to go to the bathroom, right? They always are giving off a signal. So it's now our job to help them hone in on that signal and what that internal body sensation is telling them, whether that's based off behavioral cues, like they're kind of like, doing that cross knee wiggle. Yeah. Or they're hiding under the table.
It's a classic.
Very classic. So then it's like, okay, how do we get them to hone in on those signals so we can make toileting more successful?
Toileting is a huge one, and it's a big part of it. Adolescence and childhood for a lot of our students, and it's a process that takes a really long time because of these factors. Let's also talk about feeding. We've touched on it a little bit, some of the food stuffing, which is obviously a concern, which leads to choking, not tolerating water very well, which leads to dehydration and preference for stronger flavors and crunchy things. A lot of that is, again, neurological. We can always recommend some families need to have a swallowing study and just make sure that swallowing of liquids and solids are safe. So if that applies to you, please do that before.
Always get medical checked out first. That is a golden rule for anything. Get that important medical piece out of the way, then we can talk sensory.
Exactly. But modifications can be made to food texture and food frequency and bite size, and there are some routine changes that can happen.
And I think even with feeding, I think a lot of people will be like, okay, it's the touch, the smell, and the taste, but those additional 3 senses, and I'll probably have to say this throughout the podcast because I think those additional 3 senses are so important, especially for our guys with Down syndrome. But that proprioceptive piece is so important for feeding. You need to have the right way to sit, the right position, the right posture, the right support in order to, because feeding is a really, really difficult task. We all take it for granted. But for our guys that have to deal with a weaker core and difficult with postural stability, it's even that much harder. The breathing that you need to do during feeding is really important.
A lot of coordination.
A lot of coordination. So it's important to think of the sensory piece with respect to those three senses on top of the touch, the taste, and the smell. Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about sleeping.
Yeah. So sleep, again, all senses are impacted with sleep as well. But if you're thinking about, if there's an interoceptive challenge, so they're not understanding that, their tummy is hurting or they're feeling a little sick, so sleep is going to be impacted, right? If they're constipated, sleep will definitely be impacted. If they are, very hypersensitive to sound, there might be the buzz of a light that's preventing them from sleeping.
Thunderstorm, several things.
Temperature
like that.
is not just right, or the pressure of the sheets. So again, I don't want parents to stress and panic about this. This is not across the board the same for everybody. No. These are just things where if you're having challenges with sleep, just another thing to just consider as part of your problem solving strategy. Like, I wonder if the sensory thing has anything to do with it, right? So it's just some additional tools to put in your toolkit for when you're problem solving sensory stuff, to think about that.
And I like to think of the sensory component to things because it takes some of the stress out of the interactions with the child, right? It can be clear to you then that the child is not choosing to be difficult or, harp on or really emphasize something in their environment. If you think about it as this is a neurological thing, not a personality thing, it can be easier to problem solve and kind of get on the same team as your child and work on things like that.
Absolutely. Yeah. Very well said. Yeah.
School is a sensory rich environment.
Yes. Yes, that's a positive way of looking at it for sure.
If you like sensory rich environments and if those are hard for you, then school is a hard place to be. Hina and I have worked together with many children over the years and have often run across kids who have trouble at school. So let's talk about what can happen there.
Yeah. And you're right. I mean, it is a sensory rich environment. It can be a sensory rich environment, right? So there's a difference between sensory rich versus sensory overload. Right? So sensory rich would be like all senses that you need for your day, right? But overstimulation can be, I didn't order this off the menu. Why is this happening? So, but again, it's a part and parcel of going to school. So there's tons of stuff going on at school. Alarms going off, fire alarms going off. There's a huge one for a lot of our guys. Assemblies. So that auditory volume thing is very, very difficult to manage. Partly also because of that unpredictability, right? You don't know when the alarm's going to go off. You don't know when someone's going to talk loud or not talk loud at an assembly. So that auditory piece, sometimes it's difficult with respect to visual. A lot of classrooms are riddled with stuff on their walls. And it's
a
hard.
lot of people moving around.
A lot of stuff happening where if you're hypo or hypersensitive to visual input, it can be really difficult to kind of make sense of your world in the classroom. So schools can be tricky. On the playground, it can be very tricky. If you have poor proprioceptive or vestibular, playground navigation can be really hard at school. So again, yes, Hina is talking all about challenges and things that can go wrong, but just keep reminding yourself that your OT can always help come up with some strategies so that stuff can still happen and your kid can still be successful.
So let's talk about that side of it, because that side is more fun now that we've laid out where the challenges can be. So part of your job is to figure out what is hyposensitive and what is hypersensitive. And so can you talk a little bit about how you do that? How do you figure out somebody's preferences for their sensory needs?
Yeah, great question. So as I mentioned earlier, sensory processing is very subjective. So it's a hard thing to kind of measure. But lots of progress is being made in that. And one of the things that is now being used for quite a while actually is a standardized assessment called a sensory profile. So that's kind of the gold standard at this point. And basically the sensory profile is a set of questions that we give to families, to parents, because you're seeing your kid more often than I am, or even schools, and you're answering some questions that kind of relate to each of the sensory categories, right? And so at the end, then we do some magical calculations, and then we find out, of those 8 sensory areas, where on that line is your child. So especially compared to like their peers, right? So there's some sort of norm comparison that's happening. So are they just like their peers in terms of processing visual information, or are they they process information a bit differently for vestibular than their peers, or, so it's giving us a picture at the end of the day of what sensory processing is. It gives us graphs and it gives us numbers and all that, but it kind of gives us a picture of, okay, this is what your profile is. This is what you require. And then what we do is we use those results to explain to families what their child's sensory processing challenges are, and then helps us form strategies of what we need to do.
And we often find that students come up with their own strategies, and this has another name, and it's called stimming. So let's talk about stimming. Parents don't love it on the whole, but I think it's really misunderstood.
You bet.
It's really our students trying to make their own strategies to deal with what their sensory needs are. So let's talk about that.
Yeah. So for those of you listening that may not be familiar with stimming, so the word stim is short for self-stimulation, but it's also called a whole bunch of other names, which can be tricky. It can be called stereotypy, so stereotypic movements, or automatic reinforcement. And it's basically that repetitive stereotype motor movements, the use of objects, sometimes the use of speech to for people to keep stimuli that is aversive at bay, or to bring more stimuli into their life in order to be stimulated. So some examples of stimming that are kind of very popular and people see are like rocking back and forth, the hand flapping, spinning an object, or even something like humming.
Humming, we see a lot of sort of using toys and shaking, a lot of shaking things, sometimes mouthing things and testing everything with your mouth first, or always
Grinding
wanting to be
teeth.
chewing on things, which includes, toys, fingers, hair, clothing, all of those kind of things. Teeth grinding, another really common one. I would say those are maybe like some full body stuff, some like side to side rocking, front back rocking,
whipping the head back and forth,
head
is
whipping.
a big stim. Exactly, right. So, and that's the thing. Like, there's reasons why we stim. Okay, so you mentioned at the top of your question that a lot of people view it as something negative, and it can get to that place. Stimming can be, if it's injurious to yourself or somebody else, it is something that we need to definitely kind of look at. But the important thing that we need to kind of understand is why we're stimming, right? So there's multiple reasons why stimming can occur. And again, like sensory challenges, we all stim. We all do it, right? Twirling hair, biting my nails, fidgeting. We were doing a podcast interview yesterday, and I just kind of found myself rocking back and forth. I'm like, oh, look at that. I'm stimming, right? So we're all doing it. So the stigma around it really, it's changing, albeit very slowly, the acceptance of stimming. I wish it was faster, but of course, Rome wasn't built in a day. But I think once people start to understand the reasons behind it, it's a little bit more easier to accept. So reasons can include things like if you're overstimulated. So stimming can help block out that excessive sensory input. Right.
And if you let's really think about that. So let's say you have an injury. One of the things that can be used are like those tensor electrical things, which override the pain signals to your body, right? So you're overriding one sensation with another sensation. And stimming can be used in that way. Let's say we don't like the noise in our environment. We make our own noise to cover up that one, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And things like sucking your thumb when you're a little kid. If you're stressed, if you're tired, you're bored, you need to calm yourself. You need to calm your nervous system. So you're finding ways that you can do that when you're overstimulated. It can also happen when you're understimulated. This happens a lot with our kids, right? So you're noticing if they're bored, if they're not engaged, then the stimming really happens a lot. Like grinding teeth, I find happens a lot sometimes when they're just
not sure of what's going on.
Yeah, they're chewing on everything in sight, like their shirt, because they're trying to get some more input to their body. That it's needed.
I think one of the challenges from my perspective with stimming is that what feels good to your student with Down syndrome and helps them feel better and regulated actually contradicts what the parents' sensory needs are. So the parents are overwhelmed and they don't want more noise. And the student is being loud because that's what they need to feel better. And that's a big piece of why it's so hard is because people's sensory needs are quite different.
They're at
odds with
they're
each
at
other.
odds, exactly. Yeah. And then and in a little bit we'll kind of talk a little bit about how that we can solve that particular problem. But a couple of other quick reasons for stimming could be pain reduction, right? This is something that we see all the time.
Yes.
So, there's some more serious stims like I've had, not a lot, but sometimes it does happen where like kids are banging their head. And so that's a stim that, we want to get into. We want to stop that kind of stim and figure out what we can do because it's hurting them. But then you have to think about why. Is there a medical reason, right?
And
like,
often,
are they ear infection? And often it is.
Yes.
They have a headache. They have an ear infection. There's a reason to all behavior. Always remember that.
And I've seen that too with another student who comes to mind who developed a new stim, like kind of really all of a sudden, and it was a head shake whip kind of a movement. And I was like, there is a reason we have not seen this before.
Yeah.
And that child had a really serious ear infection.
Yeah.
So if stims are like popping up and you haven't seen them and it's not in the repertoire, you want to do some problem solving as to, it's probably time for a doctor's
appointment.
Really.
And like something like an ear infection, if you have poor interoception and on top of that, a lot of our guys have trouble with communication. How else are you going to tell somebody that your ear is really hurting, right? So that's one way to do it.
Yes.
Those are behavioral cues you talked about earlier.
Exactly.
And actually, there is more research being done that stimming actually causes the release of beta endorphins in the body, which kind of causes that feeling of anesthesia or pleasure. So sometimes they do it because it feels good, right? Like we can think of examples of lots of those kind of stims.
And some people, have a rocking chair at home.
Yeah.
Well, why on earth would that exist? Well, because rocking chairs feel nice for some people, right? It's the same thing.
Exactly. Yeah. And then kind of just a quick last little thing is like it's self-regulation, right? So some stims serve the purpose of soothing and comforting. Like I said, the sucking of the thumb is a really good example that a lot of babies do to relax themselves. So just keeping in mind that stimming serves a purpose, but we need to now see what the stimming is doing and how we deal with it. Yeah.
Okay. So when we think about stimming, and thinking about how people's sensory needs can kind of be at odds with each other, the temptation might be to be like, stop it. And quit doing that. I'm going to take that thing away. I'm going to try and get you to be quiet.
It looks weird.
Yeah. And a lot of families are really sensitive to the looks of things. And I understand that because, our students already look different. And this is one of those additional markers that increases that difference. And families often don't like it. So their first inclination is to like, let's make this stop.
Yeah.
And what are your thoughts on trying to stop stimming from happening?
Let's not do that. My thoughts.
Let's not.
Let's try not to. Again, as I mentioned earlier, of course, if it is something that's injurious to themselves or others, definitely we need to, figure something out because it's not something that's gonna to help them in the long run. But as I said, that first of all, no one can really stop self-stimulatory behavior completely. It's a really tricky thing to do because everyone does it anyway. Secondly, even if one stim is removed, you stop them from doing that one twirly thing, they will often find another way to get that same experience, stimulatory experience. And usually the next stim that they find may be less preferable and harder to change. So we really need to kind of sit down and think about, does the flapping of the paper, like how disruptive is it to everyday life? How is is it really that big a deal? And of course that I think the biggest obstacle to overcome is how it looks to other people, because you're right, it does make them stand out. But then
there are some situations where I think it can be a really big deal. For example, if your child, can't let any like piece of paper alone, for example, then we have a problem on our hands. We have to do some problem solving, right? Because you need to be able to get through the world when there's paper around.
Absolutely,
But let's say somebody has a little toy that they like to flap around. I mean, is it really a problem?
Yeah. And it's just like there's a difference between eradicating a stim versus managing a stim, right? So so we can talk about that in a minute, but like, the most important reason that we don't want to eradicate or stop stimming altogether is because it may cause your loved one to withdraw more and lose your opportunity to engage in healthy interactions, right? So they're becoming more and more insular. They're like, okay, you are stopping me from doing this, so I'm just going to now do it by myself, right?
I'm going to opt not to be near you.
Absolutely. Yeah. So kind of thinking long term what the effects will be. Yeah. So, we as OTs often think about functional replacement for stims, right? So if it's something that's really, really interrupting their daily functioning and participation in life, then we can come up with something that's, sometimes more age appropriate if that's kind of helping parents deal with that too. But if in a perfect world, I would just, if they want to flap paper, I would love for them to just flap paper if it makes them feel good.
And it's on
right?
society to come around.
You're absolutely right.
There are some things though that are scary and risky. I'm thinking of mouthing items. Certainly putting everything in your mouth is we don't want that. But maybe there could be something else that you could provide to chew on. That could be a healthier, safer substitute. And they make those kind of things. We'll put some links on our episode page because we don't need trips to the ER because you've swallowed things that you shouldn't have, but we do want to find a way to get input that's going to help you feel good and be your best self.
Yeah. And I think part of it is just figuring out what are they getting out of that stim, really digging deep and what I call be a sensory detective. And this is where your OTs can definitely help you out. But if the mouthing of the object is because they just need something on their lips, something on their teeth, lots of other ways to do it rather than just pick up anything and put it in their mouth, right? So,
so let's see. Should we talk a little bit more about ways to manage stimming?
Yeah.
All right.
For sure. Yeah. So there's a few different things we can do. The first one is get your doctor to check everything out. So as we said earlier, get that medical piece figured out, no matter any major behavioral change or anything that you see that's off all of a sudden, get the medical piece taken care of because more often than not, that can help a lot.
Yep. Any new stims. And we've heard, even in like very recent interactions with families, there have been things like obstructed bowel, other things. And it's like, they just wouldn't stop making noise. And it turned out that they had major constipation or something else going on. And that's the only way they had to like let people know. So medical workup, number one, especially if you see something new.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Number two is managing the sensory environment, right? So just figuring out, okay, and we can talk about this in a little bit outside of the context of stimming, but just managing the environment and that emotional environment to maximize personal comfort, right? So just giving them what they need in a functional way so that they can get what they need in that moment.
Yeah, and we're really big fans of managing the environment, which might be things like turning lights on or off, or having fewer things in a room or more things in a room, or sometimes we'll modify like the games and things that we use to make them a little bit more clear visually. Maybe we need to use quieter voices. Maybe we need to use pumped up energy voices, right? And there's a lot of shifts that we can make as the supporting adults to try and make an environment where our student can learn and thrive.
Absolutely. Yeah. There's lots and lots of research that says that vigorous exercise reduces the need to stim. I've seen this personally in my practice, probably because exercise is associated with beta endorphins being released, right? So it's like, let's get those endorphins out, right? Like if stimming makes you feel good, let's see what else we can do that will give you that same feeling. So vigorous exercise happens quite a bit here, and we see a huge reduction in stimming, but not eradication, right? We just need it to get to the point where they can do their work and participate. A really important one, I kind of touched on this earlier, was continue interacting while the stimming is occurring. So people with sensory processing challenges often perceive the world through sensation and action, right? So a lot of our kids with Down syndrome and autism, while most neurotypical people perceive it through thought and language, right? So we're experiencing the world in a different way versus those of our friends that are, stimming. And once that difference is understood, self-stimulating behaviors make more sense, right? So you kind of understand where they're coming from at their level. So for example, engaging in a turn-taking activities or some sort of a game without trying to stop stimming during the activity. So you're just kind of incorporating an activity into the stimming. So if they love flapping a ribbon, let's, make a game out of it, right? This is the whole thing about making it functional. Let's get a really cool flappy glitter wand or something and make a dress up magical whatever game, like just incorporating that stim into something that's more engaging and meaningful can also really help reduce the stim. And then another really great thing that I would love for people to try is creating a positive association between stimming and relationship building. So again, I talked about if we're trying to stop it, it may cause our loved ones to withdraw and become a little bit more insular. So allow stimming as a reinforcer. I do this all the time with a few of my students where one of them loves to dangle anything that's like a bead or anything, and he requests it. So what we do is instead of taking it away, I'm like, okay, let's make it a part of our activity, or he loves to rock back and forth and dance. We're going to have dance parties. So this is helping our relationship as a therapist and client, but also allowing him what he needs in the moment. So yeah. And then the last one, which I highly recommend, is join the stim. Try it out. See what it feels like to you, right? There's the bond that you can create with your child or your client when you're meeting them at their level. And if they're rocking back and forth, you're rocking back and forth. It's very powerful. So that's just another thing to kind of think about. Just join in and see what is it that they get out of it. Maybe,
Yeah, it's true. I can think of so many students who have given me this look. They're just like, wait a second, you're doing it too. And there's a real connection that can arise from that. And it seems to me that our students feel seen in those moments where it's like,
absolutely,
oh, you're making space for this. Like, finally.
And it's okay. You're accepting it.
Yes.
It's okay for me to do this here. Right. And the thing is a lot of parents are concerned that, if I let them stim, they're just going to keep doing it and not do anything else. So this is where that managing of the stim can come into play, right? So for my friend that loves to dangle the beads, there's certain times when he absolutely needs it and nothing else will come close. There's other times where he sometimes forgets that he has other things that he can do to regulate. So sometimes we'll offer him other choices. And then if it is the bead and that's all, then we'll say, okay, you have 5-10 minutes with the bead and let's go do something. And then you can come back to it. Right. So just knowing that it's not being taken away and it's also always available can reduce that anxiety. And then they're like, okay, and it's not going to take away my beads. They're just right there in front of me. I'm going to try to do some stimming, get myself at a baseline, get a couple of fun things done, and then I can go back to it.
And we do try sometimes to shortcut it almost by providing something that's even more intense than what our students have available readily to them. And that's where things like our therapy swing come into play, right? For the students who really need that vestibular and probe input, we give it to them more than they could get by spinning on the floor or rocking back and forth. And then by providing it at that really high intensity, fast blast kind of thing, we can spend some time without it afterward, where we can focus in on whatever academic or language goals we might have.
Yeah, I'm so happy you mentioned that, because I think a lot of the times in school meetings, I'm like, we went for a walk around the hallway.
Not enough.
Not enough, especially for those of our guys that really seek that high intensity, high frequency. So I always say you don't have to spend a whole lot of time often to get this input, but it just needs to be at a high frequency and high intensity so that it registers and they get the most out of it. And my biggest thing with anything sensory strategy related is what I try to get families and people to understand is the concept of filling the tank. So if I can paint a picture quickly here. If a client that comes in, he's amped up, rocking back and forth, just needing so much input, and your initial thought would be like, okay, let's do calming strategies. Let's calm you down so you can sit down. It's like it's like putting a cap into a volcano that needs to explode. You know what I mean? Then it's just, it needs to erupt. Maybe, I don't know, like the analogy can work whichever way. But if you're trying to stifle and try to bring somebody down before their tank is filled with that input, then they might sit down for a couple seconds, but then worse things can happen. Behaviors can emerge or whatever, right? Tables can be cleared, things can be thrown. So if somebody's coming in that needs 20 minutes of rocking back and forth, and I'll make it functional. So we'll sing, we'll listen to music, fill up your tank first, and then we can work on the regulation piece. And I think that's sometimes where we falter, where we're just like, oh, you're really, really up there. Let's try to bring you down. No, let's meet you first, fill your tank, and then we can work on it.
I love fill the tank. I call it match and move, where I'm going to try and match my students' intensity level and what they are showing me that they need before I try and move them to a different level for, like, let's say table learning or something like that.
Absolutely.
And you will know when you've reached their need capacity. They'll give you this kind of like sigh of relief and like, phew, got it. Okay. And then they'll indicate that they're like ready to do something else now.
Yeah.
Right?
And one of the other signs similar to that is that they're, like, when they're coming in and they're amped up, they can't even tell you what they need. They're showing you. So if you give them what they need, then they're more willing to slowly get to your level and be like, communicate more. Then you're like, okay, so there's stages, right? It doesn't have to just be like, okay, we're going to dance, we're going to sit. Some days it's fine. Some days you're just going to need to spend that extra time to go through all those stages of getting from amped up to sitting at the table to do printing.
Oh yeah.
Right. So,
Absolutely.
yeah.
So when you're addressing sort of sensory needs, do you use a set program of things? Like you're going to do A, B, C, D, or do you trial a variety of different things? How do you kind of devise up a program of what will work?
Yeah, that's a great question. So this is where that sensory profile comes in handy, right? So first we need to figure out what that particular student or child's needs are. And they're different for everybody, of course. So then the goal is to create what we like to call a sensory diet, or just some sort of a sensory menu, sometimes people like to say, because with the menu, you're actually choosing what you want to do. You know, diet just sounds a little more negative or restrictive. So, so you're providing a sensory menu. So the key is to provide those necessary sensory experiences throughout the day at whatever level, whatever environment or schedule that works for them, so that their tank is filled throughout the day, right? We want to try to keep the tank full as much as possible throughout the day so that they're not seeking out how to fill that tank up in inappropriate ways, right? So, and if it's because we know that our guys rely on schedules and routine, this helps in them becoming more independent and regulating as well. They're like, oh, I'm starting to feel like I'm going to need some movement. So I know that I have this as my option. I'm going to do this, right? So it's a really powerful way to help them understand that all these options are available for them. But I think sometimes we just need to help figure out what those options are that are meeting the needs of the school or the home or the community or the clinic, but 100% meeting the needs of the person that needs that input.
And this is one of those situations where equipment is helpful. So if you need to be advocating for some equipment in your school, working with your OT on that might be very useful. Like Hina and I described earlier, you can get some things done with, like, you know, your office chair and some of that. It's not as ideal as some more specialized equipment, but it helps. Really talking to your OT and getting the scoop from them. I almost said low down, that'd be funny. But getting the scoop from them about what would be helpful before you go out and, you know, buy things that might not be the thing that you need.
Yes.
So talking to an OT would be a great thing.
Yeah, because we don't want to make the whole process impractical for families, right? So you go to OT gyms, you're like, oh, like I've had parents be like, oh, I can buy this and this. I'm like, but that's not practical for you. So let's chat about it. Swings for some are absolutely needed, and I would recommend you buy one, right?
For some people.
For some people, exactly. Exactly, right? So, but then for some, office chairs work. For some, we can do vestibular by dancing. So it's so individualized and it's not very prescriptive that way. So that's the one thing that about sensory diets is I sit down, I figure out where the challenges are, what your routine looks like, and how we can incorporate with what you already have first, and then what you need to add on top of it. Because we don't want to make it more complicated for families and add more expense, but sometimes we need to because it's that impactful for some of our kids, but sometimes it doesn't have to work that way.
Totally. Well, Hina, this has been great. I think this is a really important discussion to have because, again, it's one of those things that is in the day for most of our students, a good portion of our students, and it does absolutely impact participation and family well-being. So this is an important chat to have.
Yeah.
Thanks for letting me pick your brain.
Absolutely. No, and I'm so happy to be able to kind of do a deep dive because I think often in OT presentations, we just touch on it and there's still so much more deep diving to do. But I hope that this kind of provides families with just a little bit more information on what sensory stuff is. Because like you said, it is very nebulous and it's, everyone just uses terms differently. So I'm just hoping that this gives a bit more clarity for families. So yeah, but thanks for letting me do it.
Oh, my pleasure. Okay.